Good morning.
Hello.
Imagine you're in church and the collection is coming around.
Sorry about that, folks. Sorry.
You've got a good turnout.
Yeah, always.
Really? How marvellous. La da 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 dee. Walk. Let me think. Da da dee da da. Why don't you go there, just behind that woman, just tuck in there, and we'll get a chair. There is a chair there.
We have a chair in front for Patricia.
Oh, do you? All right, marvellous.
Oh,
good. Go out. Go out and around the other side is probably quicker. Yeah. There's a chair there. See, there's a very nice chair just back there. Great. Full house.
We checked it this morning.
No, it's great.
I'm on my own. We're down to 2 staff in the museum and the caretaker. So I have no one to help me. No, I think that's everything. That's lovely. Thank you. Normally,
I'm sorry, I have no change.
I saw you in Mitchelstown the last time.
Ah, really? Yeah. You were there. That was a good day, actually, wasn't it? All right. It was a beautiful day. I mean, the weather was sensational. This was a conference to mark. I was going to say to commemorate the 100th anniversary of Mitchelstown Castle being burnt in the summer, which was a very good conference, actually. Oh, she's locked it.
Oh, there's a great crowd here.
I know. I'm very impressed.
No trouble getting the money out.
No, and well, also no trouble in getting them all to come out as well on a dank Saturday morning.
But the lectures are great. Venue is lovely.
Could always let it down today now.
No, you're brilliant.
Oh, well, no, don't be flattering me before I've started. Save that for afterwards.
Robert, I just
Yes.
want to double check.
Yeah, oh, don't bother with
How
any
do
of
I
that.
pronounce, is it Aesthete or?
Aesthete, yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
I just use your, some of these.
Yeah.
Aesthete.
So my exhibition has just opened, by the way, at the Architectural Archive. It opened on Thursday night of my photographs. It's on for the month, but I'll say that to them.
Yeah.
Listen, I always think, don't bother introducing me. I know who I am, and I can tell
you
them.
can tell them.
Exactly,
Are
make
you
it
mic'd
easier.
up and
I am, I'm all mic'd up, so I'm ready to go when you are.
Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all very much for coming. Apologies, as I said, I am on my own today and it's a little bit hectic. Normally I have a security guard, as you might recall, at the front desk. Downstairs, they never showed up this morning. So I was in 2 places at one time. So my apologies. I'm delighted to see such a turnout. I think it just proves what I was saying at the initial lecture about the topic and the interest it garners. And I'm delighted this morning to have Robert O'Byrne. As he says, he knows who he is, so he's going to introduce himself a lot better than I can. So we're going to be very prompt. And actually, I just want to welcome anybody who's listening online. I actually got some great feedback during the week that we have somebody listening online live that couldn't make it with us. So to those people that are online, I hope you'll enjoy the lecture as well as much as the people here. So I'll hand you over to Robert.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you, Julia. Yes, so my name is Robert O'Byrne, and I'm very happy, for personal reasons actually, to be here in Clonmel because my mother came from Clonmel. She grew up just outside the town in a house called the Wilderness, which was demolished, I think, about 50 years ago. But that was my mother's family home. And then when I was talking to my sister on the phone yesterday, she told me that our grandmother's family owned Hearns Hotel, which is directly behind here. So in other words, I have lots of Clonmel links, which I really ought to know better. So hence, I'm very glad to be here, and apologies for not knowing your town as well as I ought, since it is also, in part at least, through descent, my town too. So we're going to crack along today. There's a lot to talk about. The Irish country house in the 21st century. Julia said I can explain myself. About 10 years ago, I've always been very involved with architectural heritage. My very first job actually was in County Tipperary. Some of you may know the Damer House in Roscrea. To the north of the county, I was the curator there 40 years ago and lived rather chillily in the building, in a flat inside the house after it had been saved by the Irish Georgian Society. And as I said, that was 40 years ago, so it's always been an interest of mine. And 10 years ago, in September 2012, I started a website, a blog, called the Irish Aesthete. I was going to call it the Ascetic Aesthete, but I thought that was absolutely impossible to pronounce, particularly if you'd taken a drink. So I simplified it to the Irish Aesthete. And you'll find it on all social media now, and I write several times a week about Ireland's architectural heritage, about historic buildings right around the country. As I say, it's available on all sorts of different sites. During the pandemic, then I started a YouTube channel, so I've got rather more subscribers than that now, I'm happy to say. And you can find little films there where I'm talking about buildings and so forth. And on Thursday, an exhibition of my photographs opened in the Irish Architectural Archive. Some of you may know that, a wonderful resource in Merrion Square in Dublin. And over 10 years, I've taken probably in the region of about 50,000 photographs, all with my mobile phone. So the pictures you'll see are all taken with a phone. The secret to taking a good photograph, professional photographers stop listening right now. The secret to taking a good photograph is really a steady hand. So just don't drink too much the night before. And you can take good pictures, I'm convinced of it. So this is really an opportunity for me to look at the history of the country house over the last 100 years and bringing it up to the present day. So the less said about the 20th century, I often think, when it comes to country houses, the better. Let's just say country houses, by and large, did not have a very good 20th century. Many of them, as you will know, around 300, we estimate, were burnt during the War of Independence, followed by the Civil War. Marlfield, which is a house not too far from here, the Bagwell home, as you know, was one of those burnt, but subsequently rebuilt. Many others. Summerhill, which is quite close to where I live in County Meath, an extraordinary house, that was lost. Moy Drum in County Westmeath. all over the country, houses were burnt and lost forever, and only a handful of them were rebuilt. Along with the buildings themselves, of course, the contents of those houses, the accumulation of centuries was also lost in many instances. However, from the 1960s onwards, the number of houses, because we had a bad 40s, 50s as well, a lot of houses. I'm thinking of somewhere like, for example, Shanbally Castle, which you may know near Clogheen. Well, you wouldn't know it because, of course, it was demolished, and the stones of it, Nash's finest work in Ireland, the stones of it ground up to be used for road making. So alas, Shanbally was completely lost, one of the great losses of the middle of the 20th century, despite a lot of people petitioning for its preservation. From the 60s onwards, there started to be a greater awareness of the necessity to intervene to preserve this aspect of our collective heritage, thanks to organisations such as the Irish Georgian Society, with which I've been involved for many years. And as a result, it was responsible for the initial saving of Castletown House in County Kildare, the largest, earliest, finest Palladian house in Ireland, dating from the early 1720s. And smaller houses, again, when I was living in Roscrea, not too far from me, was this wonderful house, Roundwood in County Laois, which is now a very charming sort of country house hotel, B&B, which I would recommend visiting if you wish. And then there were other events, such as 1988's Vanishing Country Houses of Ireland, with its accompanying melancholy catalogue that some of you may still have. It's a very useful document for knowing what houses were listed there, county by county, that had been lost over the previous 100 years. And this kind of pioneering work started to change attitudes, but only very slowly. There's a copy of that catalogue, by the way, in case any of you don't know it. If you want to be miserable, I recommend you buy a copy. There was a growing awareness towards, in the last decades of the 20th century, that something had to be done, that merely lamenting the loss, producing documents such as this, or trying to rescue a handful of properties, was never really going to be sufficient. And there was an increasing recognition that if Ireland's remaining country houses were not merely to survive, as many of them just about had done until then, but also to thrive, then there needed to be a proper strategy to secure their future. Now, the first attempt to devise such a strategy occurred way back in 1985, when a body called Irish Historic Properties Commission, established just 3 years earlier, I should say, in 1982. It produced a report written by the late Professor Kevin B. Nolan, some of you may have known Kevin, and Lewis Clohessy, and it was called Safeguarding Historic Houses. And it stated forcefully that, I quote, "Our heritage historic properties cannot be preserved without the active and consistent support of the Irish government." 8 years later, in 1993, the Irish Georgian Society and another organisation since gone, Irish Heritage Properties, held a conference on the future of the Irish country house, subsequently publishing a report on its proceedings. And I must say, 29 years later, it can make for, again, melancholy reading, since so many of the problems highlighted at that time remain in place, not least the want of sufficient support from central and local government. 10 years after that, Professor Terence Dooley, whose work I'm sure some of you are familiar with, he produced a report, A Future for Irish Historic Houses, a study of 50 houses. And that was at the request again of the Irish Georgian Society and the Department of the Environment, Heritage and Local Government. A year after that, the same department invited Indicon International Consultants to produce an examination of the issue of trust-type organisations to manage heritage properties in Ireland. And then most recently, in 2015, the Department of Arts, Heritage and the Gaeltacht, in collaboration with Irish Historic Houses Association, of which more in due course, after extensive consultation with a wide variety of interested parties and stakeholders, I actually was one of the people who sat in on those meetings, it issued an action plan for the sustainable future of the Irish historic house in private ownerships. And this was a document which was subsequently approved by the Irish Cabinet. So, in other words, having rattled through all of those, no one can complain that the challenges facing the Irish country house in recent times have been insufficiently examined and analysed. Produced over a period, therefore, of 37 years, these and other documents are frequently not very encouraging, since so many of the problems highlighted throughout that time remain in place, not least the want of sufficient support, this is going to be my echo, from central and local government. I would say more positively, during the same period that all this official and semi-official investigation of the subject was occurring, so was something else, and that was a growing public interest in the Irish country house as part of our social and cultural history, and a huge flood, could call it nothing else, of publications exploring different aspects of this social and cultural history. There had been a certain number of documents produced more than 100 years ago looking at the Irish country house prior to the beginning of the 21st century. If we go back, there's the 5th volume of the original Irish Georgian Society's records. This came out in 1913, and some of you may have seen it. And then 2 years later, in 1915, this book appeared, Georgian Mansions in Ireland, an invaluable resource since quite a number of the houses featured in it and photographed for it have since been lost. So it was extraordinarily helpful to have these early documents. As far as serious academic study of Ireland's country houses is concerned, that really was only initiated in the 1960s by the late Desmond Fitzgerald, the Knight of Glyn, who some of you, I'm sure, knew. And Desmond, when he was a young man, had started work on a PhD on Irish Palladianism at Harvard, but because of other activities in his life, he never completed his PhD, but he very much used that material for a series of articles for Country Life, for Apollo magazine, for the Irish Georgian Society's own bulletin. So much of his interest in the subject and his study of it was recycled and available to the general public. See, hitherto really, Irish architecture and indeed our decorative arts, if you look at publications, most of which were produced in England and abroad, tended to be rather dismissive of our own native architecture and our country houses, and they were regarded as a kind of minor hybrid and a rather weak form of the original, which of course occurred in England. And it was considered, in a lot of cases, Irish architecture and Irish country house design to be rather amusing in its own way, but not to be taken terribly seriously. Now, Desmond Fitzgerald and others rightly, correctly challenged that view, proposing instead that the Irish country house and its contents had their own distinctive character, worthy of specific study and, most importantly, of adequate respect. So, similar works duly appeared from the likes of Maurice Craig. Again, some of you may have known Maurice, not least a wonderful book, the title of which I always adore, Classic Irish Houses of the Middle Size, which is a terrific read because in that book, Maurice's focus was not on the great houses like Castletown, but on smaller, middle-sized houses, which have their own distinctive character and decorative style worth celebrating. There then began a great wave of country house books that you may be familiar with. The first of these appeared in 1971, Irish Houses and Castles by the late Desmond Guinness and William Ryan, and many more followed. Some of them rather exercises in nostalgia, like Andrew Bush's Bonnetstown, a book you may have seen, which is now a collector's item, a beautiful book of photographs of Bonnetstown, a rather magical mid-18th century house in County Kilkenny. As I say, they were rather nostalgic and elegiac in tone, but others beginning to probe beneath the surface, thanks to the likes of Peter Somerville Large and Mark Bench Jones. Again, you may be familiar with these books, which appeared in the 80s. And then there were a whole wave of novels, as there always had been. I mean, we go back to 1800 and Maria Edgeworth and Castle Rackrent, if you want studies of the Irish country house and its precipitate decline. But of course, Molly Keane very much came to the fore during this same period with her books, although these were inclined to encourage the popular view of the Irish country house as being somewhat quirky and often inhabited by eccentric characters and somewhat ramshackle altogether. It's safe to say that only really in the present century, the beginning of the 21st century, the study of Irish country houses as a really serious academic topic was initiated, and this began in 2001 with the appearance of this book by the aforementioned Terry Dooley, who is attached to Maynooth, as I'm about to tell you. There are a number of points to be made about the decline of the big house in Ireland. The first is it's an extremely good book. It's thoroughly researched, it's academic, yet, which isn't always the case with academic works, it's entirely readable. The second point to make is that Terry isn't an art historian and so brought a different and fresh perspective to the subject. And thirdly, unlike most of the people who I've been discussing hitherto, his book wasn't written by what we might call an insider. He doesn't come from the country house background and can't be said to have any vested interest in promoting the subject. And frankly, in this country, that remains an important fact, I think. And then since then, Terry has done a lot more. I've already mentioned the paper that he produced some years ago in 2003 for the IGS and the Department of the Environment, Heritage and Local Government. But even more significantly, he then established a new faculty at Maynooth University, the Centre for the Study of Historic Houses and Estates, which has frankly revolutionized the way in which country houses here are seriously investigated. A considerable number of books have been produced by the Centre and its key figures. You can see some of these now. These come out every year by people who've studied at the Centre under Terry and his colleagues. As a result, a whole wave of interest in this topic has been sparked throughout the country. Another very positive development, again by Terry and the Centre, is the annual Country House Conference hosted at Maynooth University. And one of the most useful features, to my mind, is that these events often look at the history and current situation of country houses in other countries, because too often we can be overly introverted, and such initiatives place the Irish Country House in a European and global context, and I think that's very essential for all of us. In the area of academic study in the Irish Country House, a few other trailblazers I think would be useful to mention, not least some of you may know him and his work, Toby Bernard, with his focus on material culture in Ireland during the 17th and 18th century, much of it, of course, centred around the decoration and furnishings of the country house in this country. And then such work has in turn led to greater attention being paid as to how such buildings were used. A relatively recent example being this book, Patricia McCarthy's Life in the Country House in Georgian Ireland. And I also think one needs to mention a growing number of more specialist areas of investigation, such as Conor Lucy, who's attached to UCD, and his focus on plasterwork in Ireland, and Alison Fitzgerald, who is attached to Maynooth University and writes extensively on Irish silver. There have been a number of broader studies, often catalogues for exhibitions, and this was possibly the most important exhibition regarding this field in this century so far. This extraordinary exhibition, Ireland, Crossroads of Art and Design, 1690 to 1840. Now, one would have hoped this exhibition would have been held and celebrated in Ireland. In fact, Ireland declined to host it. It was held in Chicago in the Institute of Art there. It was an extraordinary exhibition. It was a stunning celebration of our remarkable craftsmen during this period. And it was held only in Chicago. It was such a surprising success that it was extended for another 6 weeks after its initial run. I would highly recommend a copy of this catalogue to you all as well. It really is a great celebration of all that's best about Irish design during the period. There's also other scholarly work. You may be familiar with these, which come out every year, Irish Architectural and Decorative Studies. Again, a lot of focus in those on the Irish Country House. This is produced by the Irish Georgian Society. So it's really not an exaggeration to say that over the past 15 or 20 years, there's been a veritable explosion of publications relating to various aspects of the Irish Country House. One or two of them, I will allow, written by myself. Now, some of them also have been explorations of individual houses which have been restored since the year 2000. Books produced either for public consumption, such as this particularly handsome one on Ballyfin. I'm sure all of you stayed on a regular basis in Ballyfin, County Laois. And then this is Kieran Riley, who's attached to Maynooth University, a rather wonderful book on a house called Capard, a beautiful Regency house, also in County Laois, actually. And then others that are very much for private consumption. A man called John Malone restored a vast 19th century Gothic house in County Wicklow, Humewood, and this book was produced for him. So, in other words, today there's an awful lot more material about Irish country houses on my shelves, and perhaps on yours too, than would have been the case at the beginning of the 21st century. Scientia potentia est. Knowledge is power. That's according to Sir Francis Bacon, or perhaps Thomas Hobbes. There seems to be some dispute who said it first. However, in any case, the fact is indisputable. as I say, over the past couple of decades, we have come to know a great deal more about the Irish country house than we ever did before. But what are we doing with all of that knowledge? Has it been, as it frequently is in academic circles, an end in itself? Do we just relish knowing more? Could we stand being accused as a kind of academic eunuchs, knowing how it's done but not actually doing it? Or have we discovered what we've discovered? Have we been able to put what we've discovered to really practical use? I have to say my own response that if knowledge really is power, has that power been exercised? And I would say insufficiently, and often perhaps a little too gently. We could be, I think, and we need to be perhaps much more aggressive about how we advocate the preservation and appreciation and celebration of our country houses than has been the case hitherto. Let's look at a few initiatives, both private and public, which have occurred over the past 20 years, since the beginning of the 21st century. The first of these is an organisation called the Irish Heritage Trust, which was officially established in July 2006. The IHT was really largely the brainchild of a man called Sir David Davis, who until a couple of years ago owned a house called Abbey Leaks in County Laois. And he's also the current president of the Irish Georgian Society. Now, David, like a lot of us, had long been aware that we have no equivalent in Ireland, to the astonishment often of visitors, of the National Trust that you find in Northern Ireland, in Scotland, in England, in Wales, and so forth. We don't have the equivalent here. So the IHT, the Irish Heritage Trust, was intended to help fill that vacuum. And David worked very closely with relevant government departments and so forth, and therefore, ultimately, when it was established in July 2006, it was given a mandate, an official mandate by the state to acquire heritage properties deemed to be at risk and to provide for their preservation, maintenance, and appreciation by the public. The state agreed to offer tax breaks to donors of properties to the trust, the amount of tax relief available in any year limited to €6 million. And funding of €5 million was to be provided in the first year to enable endowment funds to be set up by the trust, with more to follow from the government in subsequent years. It was precisely following the model of the National Trust, and it was an extremely good idea and promised well, but it was, of course, as ever, dependent on one important thing: government support. The IHT embarked on its work after its establishment and began negotiating with the owners of the first proposed acquisition, which is a house which has now subsequently actually been taken over by the Office of Public Works, Ansgrove in County Cork, that some of you may be familiar with. And then, alas, we had a recession, and the promised money from the government was withdrawn. The government basically said, yes, we know we agreed, it's on the public record and so forth, that we're going to give you this money, but actually we're not, after all. So the whole raison d'etre for the IHT disappeared. In the meantime, it had actually taken over responsibility for Photo House in County Cork, that some of you may know, and its grounds. And what are we up to now? There's Heritage Trust. New Heritage, exactly, this is when it was set up there. And this is Photo, obviously, which it had taken over responsibility. And then today it also takes care of Strokestown in County Roscommon, which you'll be familiar with, and most recently Johnstown Castle in County Wexford, which has been owned for many years by Chuggask, Ireland's Agriculture and Food Development Authority. In effect, what the IHT has become is a property management agency for properties that are already either in public or private ownership and are restored and ready to go, but need somebody to actually manage the day-to-day running of them. And that's what it's become, which is not at all what it was intended to be. It does a very good job within its current brief, but the opportunity to establish an Irish equivalent of the National Trust was missed, with consequences, because a number of important houses, which it would have been able, had it fulfilled its original brief, it would have been able to save, have since been lost, as we'll see. A second organisation which shouldn't be ignored and of which I'm a great fan is the Historic Houses of Ireland, formerly called the Irish Historic Houses Association. This was established in 2008 by a group of private owners of historic properties who recognized that if they were to engage meaningfully with government departments and statutory bodies and so forth, then they needed to do so as a single representative organization rather than approaching the relevant official bodies individually. So that's what the HHI does. And as I say, I'm a huge fan of it. And a couple of years ago, I persuaded a wealthy fellow I know to fund an annual prize, which we give to a private house owner, really just to say well done for battling on so valiantly, and also to try and bring more attention to this sector, which I think is often insufficiently appreciated, as we'll see. I don't think the task is easy. It's not easy for the HHI, and there have been setbacks. One of the problems, of course, is that this is a voluntary body made up of people who have to undertake the organization's work while trying to get on with their own lives, and in most cases trying to keep the roof on with their own properties. It was a key player in the 2015 report that I mentioned, the Action Plan for the Sustainable Future of the Irish Historic House in Private Ownership, and made sure of its acceptance by government, and it continues to work hard to assist members and to represent their best interests. So as I say, I'm a huge fan and supporter of the HHI. That's a couple of the ventures, but given the number of reports that I've gone through, what about the state support for the sector, for the Irish Country House? Well, one of the best known mechanisms, some of you may be familiar with it, it's possible some of you may even use it, is called Section 482, or to give its full title, Section 482 of the Taxes Consolidation Act 1997. Which was based on an earlier act that came out in 1982. In case you're not familiar with 482, it provides tax relief to the owner/occupier of an approved building, including the surrounding grounds, gardens, or an approved garden existing independently for costs incurred by its repair, maintenance, or restoration. So in other words, you can get tax relief for those tasks, provided, of course, that you open to the public for 60 days of the year, 40 of those days during the summer months, and for at least 4 hours on each occasion. And the Department of Revenue are extremely good at following up. So you may have publicly announced that you're going to be open on Tuesday from 10 till 2, but if you slip out to buy a pint of milk and the revenue people turn up, you're going to find yourselves in trouble. Now, for many people, many property owners, certainly 482 has proven invaluable, but it doesn't work for everybody. Some people, for example, don't have the financial means to carry out that repair and restoration, which would in turn allow for the relief, the tax relief. But overall, Section 482, which was actually subject of a very serious scrutiny and review by Revenue just a couple of years ago, we all furiously wrote in supporting it. I think it can definitely be judged overall a very good thing and a very essential thing. And there are a number of other government schemes offering assistance to owners of historic properties. There is, we could go on forever, they're always being announced. There's one called the Built Heritage Investment Scheme, which offers funds for the repair and conservation of structures that are protected under the Planning Development Acts. I'm going to come to that in a while. There's Historic Structures Funds. There's just endless ones. The Built Heritage Investment Scheme. Each of these, the amount that's offered is several million every year. Either the local authority or the Heritage Council tends to actually run them on the ground and administer the grant levels. The grants frequently aren't as large as one might like, but look, on the other hand, every little helps, as a certain supermarket chain tells us. And also, really the big difficulty, of course, is it's always based on matching funding. So you may have a roof that needs repair and the relevant builder tells you, well, this week at least it's going to cost 40,000. You have to cough up 20,000, and for a lot of people that still is a serious issue, finding the relevant funds so that they can in turn benefit from these government grants. And I think that's at least one of the reasons why country house owners continue, regrettably, to feel obliged ultimately to sell up because they can't manage it. They're asset rich but cash poor. And the buildings they own and the contents they're in may be worth a reasonable amount of money, but they lack the funds to meet their day-to-day running costs. So, albeit at a slower pace than was the case back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, even the 80s, the sale of country houses in Ireland continues, and this must be a matter of regret, especially when a place has been in the same family for many generations, because with their departure goes not just part of the immediate area's history, but of our collective heritage as well. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. This is Milford in County Carlow, built at the very start of the 19th century for the Alexander family, who weren't actually members of the gentry. Milford, because they had a very large mill, the largest in Ireland at the time, right next door to the house. And it remained with the original owner's descendants until just 4 years ago, when it was sold, and all the wonderful contents were dispersed in a sale as well. So all of those possessions acquired by generations of Alexanders scattered. And the consequence of that, of course, is the story that that house told has also been lost. More recently, in January 2020, Sotheby's offered at auction a large number of items from Killadoon in County Kildare. Killadoon, a really superlative house built for the Clements family in the 1770s, and it had remained in their ownership for the best part of 250 years. And like Milford, it was sold. Fortunately, in this case, the current generation of the family were persuaded to leave some items on long-term loan in Ireland, and they're now available. You can see some of them in Castletown, you can see some of them in Doneraile Court, which I'll mention shortly, and a number of other houses. But a lot of material that you see here was sold, as I say, at Sotheby's, because I went over to give a lecture at Sotheby's about the place beforehand. There have been other, and to my mind, greater losses in recent years, and I could probably give an entire lecture on sad stories of lost country houses in the last 20 years. But we'll move on and say that basically the first and most obvious point is that in the 21st century, our stock of country houses, still retaining their contents and still cared for by the same family, continues to diminish, at least in part because there are insufficient support mechanisms to which they can turn for help. Now, there's an issue as well for me about house contents, which I think is very important. I'm trying to think what the next picture is. Peer. Oh yes, I'll come on to that. This is the present one I'm coming on to. So, Ireland has never had any kind of national inventory, so we don't actually know what was here, what even is here today. And we don't usually know until it pops up at an auction, such as these that are held every year by Adams, formerly in Slane Castle and now in Townley Hall in County Louth. Now, obviously, some of these items remain in Ireland, but a lot have always left the country, unlikely ever to return. I suspect most of you are unaware that for many decades, legislation has existed on the Irish statute books, which is supposed to ensure that valuable pictures, furniture, and so forth remain in Ireland. The Documents and Pictures Regulation of Export Act dates from 1945 and was in theory at least supplemented by the National Cultural Institutions Act of 1997. The idea behind these pieces of legislation is that before any item over a fairly low value, €10,000 or so, can leave the country, the parties responsible, usually the auction house, are responsible to seek permission, are required to seek permission from government-appointed authorities such as the National Museum, the National Gallery, and so forth. However, remarkably, there is no known instance where an export license has been refused, ever since 1945. It is a rubber stamping exercise that has gone on for decades. It's quite extraordinary. Auction houses have long understood that this is a mere paper-filling formality that they go through. And I have, at home, shelves replete with catalogues of country house content sales, as I'm sure you do. You know, vendors vend, buyers buy, auctioneers auction. Across millennia, collections have been assembled and dispersed. That's the way of the world. So there are no villains here, and no one can be castigated for acting in an untoward or illegal fashion. But there is, as has been the case for too long, evidence of clear neglect and a want of initiative on the part of the Irish state towards what becomes of our patrimony, and an obvious want of concern over how this has been steadily whittled down year by year and house by house. This attitude compares very poorly with that in the rest of Europe, where export licenses are extremely hard to acquire. A couple of years ago, for example, in England, the British government stopped a portrait from 1530 by Pontormo. I don't know if you're familiar with Pontormo, a wonderful Italian mannerist artist. This extraordinary 1530 portrait had hung in a country house in England for a long time. And the British government put a stop on it for 6 months to see if a national institution, such as the National Gallery, could acquire funds from various resources to keep it in the country. And this happens all the time. This never happens in Ireland. You'd have to prove that Pontormo's grandmother came from County Roscommon if you wanted to ensure the picture would stay here. There's not a hope otherwise there would be any guarantee that it would remain in the country. And this goes on all the time. So really, the laws are toothless and pointless in this instance. Moving on. So I've always thought of the Irish country house. What's we got next here? Oh yeah, Lissadell, you see, for example, there's a good example, of a house, the Gore booth selling up. Huge appeals for the state to acquire it. It wasn't. A lot of the material left the country. The current owners saved what they could and still have it in the house, but an enormous amount lost. Yeah, that's another annual sale from Fonzie. Of course, I'm sure you're all familiar with his work. Yeah, there's another sale. Gosh, anyway, just to show you some of the endless pictures I have of catalogues. I think it's very important to understand what I would always call the holy trinity of the country house. There are 3 elements to it, and you can't fully understand one without all 3, namely the house, its contents, and its context, that is to say, the surrounding domain. And you need all 3 to understand any of them properly. And that's very important to me to understand. The importance of that context has been, until now, really insufficiently well understood. And in fact, the last couple of years, I have been doing a great deal of work on the history of the Irish country house garden and its evolution. Some of you may have seen a couple of television programs that I made on Ireland's historic gardens last year that were shown on RTE. And I organised a couple of exhibitions. We had a conference a year ago. There's a rather wonderful book, if I may say so by myself, co-edited by me on the history of the Irish country house garden, and so on and so forth. So what we're trying to do with all of that work is to have people better understand that you can't understand the house unless you have the setting and you fully appreciate the setting, that you need one to understand the other. And similarly, the setting, if the house is lost, the example I always give in that regard is Haywood, which some of you may know, the wonderful Lutyens Gardens in Haywood. Now, alas, the house was accidentally burnt in the late 1940s and then demolished. The remains were demolished. It's very hard to read, as I would call it, Lutyens' gardens, because the house which sat in the middle of them has gone. And you see very often as well, for example, country houses which have been saved, so to speak, but the land all around has been sold off. And so you have this strange anomaly of this big house surrounded by lots of small houses or hotel extensions or whatever else, as we'll see. Now, I'm briefly going to touch on now another interesting point, actually, which is one of the great saviours of country houses in Ireland in the last century and into the beginning of this century were religious orders. Enormous numbers of houses were bought from the late 19th century onwards by religious orders and used for various purposes, for seminaries, for schools, obviously a lot of them and so forth. This is Belinter, not too far from me, a very interesting 18th century house designed by Richard Castle for the Preston, a branch of the Preston family. It was a convent until 20 odd years ago, maybe less even, and it's now a country house hotel. Emo Court, wonderful house. James Gandon's only large country house in Ireland was owned by the Dawsons, who became Earls of Portarlington. It was sold in 1930 to the Jesuit order, who had a seminary. Seminary? Did Jesuits have seminaries? Anyway, it was used by them. They actually did all sorts of extraordinary things to the interior and took out columns and moved the parts of the building around, but they kept everything they'd taken out. So when they then moved out of it, and it was bought by a wonderful man called Cholmondeley Harrison, he was able to restore it back, and he in turn then left it to the state, which is why we have Emo Court today. Not all religious orders have necessarily done such a good job. This is South Hill in County Westmeath, again not too far from me. It was owned by a branch of the Chapman family. It's actually where Lawrence of Arabia's father used to live before he ran off with the governess, I should say, and had several children, including Lawrence of Arabia. but this would have been Lawrence of Arabia's family home, although I'll show you another house in a moment, which is also connected with Lawrence of Arabia. Anyway, it was acquired by an order of nuns who've built vast ranges all around it, really sort of architectural mediocrity surrounding the house, like this, very dreary, ranges all around the building. Nevertheless, the real horror story I'm showing you next is this one. Loch Glynn in County Roscommon. It was a branch of the Dillon family built this. And again, the early 20th century it was acquired. Actually, again, we think it was a Richard Castle designed house. The missionaries of Mary owned here, and they decided to go for a vast expansion of the house. So the front of it now looks like that. This extraordinary church they decided to drop in on one side. Really bizarre, but it gets worse. Anyway, inevitably, as so often happens, the nuns moved out, it was sold, it was bought by a group of developing people who wanted to do all the usual things, hotel, golf course, spa. You'd think people in this country had never washed before spas came into existence. Anyway, all these standard issues, but they went bust, of course, with the recession, and the house has sat neglected ever since. That's the front of the chapel. This, looking like a sort of 1960s idea of a spaceship, is the back of it. Quite extraordinary. And the whole place now has been heavily vandalized. It's all just boarded up. It's just sitting there overlooking Loch Glynn. A great loss, unfortunately, to, again, our collective heritage. Where are we going next? Oh, yeah, this is the house again. That's what it looks like now. But the horses are happy, at least. When I was there, anyway. Many historic houses, did survive with religious orders. Two things happened at the beginning of the 21st century. First of all, numbers of people entering these religious orders took a nosedive, as we're all familiar with. Therefore, they couldn't maintain these large properties. And secondly, the Celtic tiger struck us, and suddenly hotels with golf courses and the aforementioned spas sprang up everywhere. A good example of this, for example, is Dunboyne Castle in County Meath, which was again owned by nuns. It's on the outskirts of Dublin. It has these ravishing 1770s Rococo ceilings in all the main rooms. Really wonderful. But again, of course, the point is that those houses, as hotels, aren't big enough. So Dunboyne House sits now in the middle of all of that. This is what I mean about context. It is very hard to understand the hotel now, the house now, because of everything else that's gone on around it. And it looks like some poor little survivor in the midst of all of this. Now, I'm going to bring another piece of legislation, I'm afraid. I'm watching my time as well. I hope I'm all right. Tell me to shut up if you need to, Julia.
10 minutes?
Oh, no, 15, please. I want to give a couple of good news stories as well. So I'm going to move at the most terrifying speed now. Okay, the 2000 Planning Act. So this is now 22 years old. It's a dauntingly substantial document, but one section in it specifically deals with architectural heritage. Arising from the Act, all local authorities throughout the country are legally obliged, as you may know, to keep a record of protected structures as part of the authority's respective development plan. What qualifies as a protected structure? That it is any building the relevant authority deems to be of special interest from an architectural, historical, archaeological, artistic, cultural, scientific, social, or technical point of view. If you're the owner or occupier of a protected structure, you in turn are legally obliged to prevent it becoming endangered, whether through damage or neglect. And there are a wide range of powers available to the self-same local authorities to help ensure the protected structures in their area receive due care. These can include fines, they can include carrying out necessary repair and maintenance work and then billing the owner. They can even include compulsory purchase. The problem is that local authorities, other than having to compile their protected structures register, are not actually obliged to exercise any of the other powers available to them. And understandably, therefore, wishing to avoid trouble and the prospect of being tied up in expensive legislation, they don't. And so we have all sorts of houses. This is, where is this? Oh, this is a house on the outskirts of Clonmel called, I want to say it's called Oakfield. I'm now immediately forgetting his name. Oaklands. Oaklands, exactly. So this is Oaklands, which I clambered around a couple of years ago when in this part of the country. And this is, alas, this is what it looks like today. And there are too many of those. I mean, for me, I'm not wishing to knock Tipperary, but for me, one of the great problems is this Knocklofty. Knocklofty is a serious concern that we should all be worried about because it's such an important house here, and to see it. And the other one, which I won't show you, I don't know why I have that photograph in there. That's actually, again, on the outskirts, but it is Kilmanahan Castle. It's just across the border in County Waterford, which again, I explored. A nice farmer gave me a ladder to climb up over a wall and get down the other side so I could have a look at it. The nice farmer then said, "Okay, I'm gone now," and took the ladder with him. I am frankly amazed I'm still here, or at least not on crutches. Anyway, Kilcooley is another house I'd be very worried about it within Tipperary. But look, this is a big issue. It's a universal issue. This, you may know or know of this house, Vernon Mount, which is on the outskirts of Cork. A wonderful house with extraordinary interiors with these grisaille panels all over the site, inside by Nathaniel Grogan the Younger. And this went through endless. The local authority kept saying to the owners who are based in America, "You have to do something." They kept saying to the local authority. Nothing happened. 2016, this is how the house ended up looking. If you think of it there, this is how it ended up. And then this happened in 2016. Vandals broke in, set the place alight. It has been a shell ever since. This is another very important house, very similar to it, on the outskirts of Dublin, Belcamp, which again was a religious order, had a long time. It's very important because it had a tower in the grounds built in homage to George Washington. Indeed, Vernon Mount also was named after Mount Vernon, George Washington's country estate. Belcamp, then all sorts of things happened to it, and within a month of Vernon Mount going up in flames, Belcamp also was gutted by fire. It's now a housing estate with a shell of the house in the middle of it on the outskirts of Dublin. There are loads of examples of this. In fact, that's Belcamp today, or not that long ago. This is Ardagh, County Longford, which I was exploring a while ago. It was the Sisters of Mercy. They sold up. It's sitting there empty and falling to pieces now. So I'm going to be positive now. We've got 10 minutes of positivity. Oh, that's Ardagh, sadly, as well. Okay, Castletown, Office of Public Works is doing huge amounts of work at Castletown. You will know it was saved initially in the 1960s by Desmond Guinness and then the Irish Jordan Society. So it's a wonderful property now. It's really the OPW would itself fall back on that old cliche. It's the jewel in their crown. But it is terrific to have that. This is a picture I took of the plasterwork on the stairs, although alas, the stairs are closed at the moment. Emo Court as well, they're doing huge amounts of work in Emo Court at the moment. I was there a few weeks ago. It's all been stripped back, but they have to do work on the roof and the windows, but it's preserved for the future generations. This is the rotunda in the centre of Emo Court. The floor is fantastic, that wonderful inlaid marquetry floor. Dunnerail Court in County Cork, which had been neglected for 25 years, and then just before the pandemic it reopened. A great friend of mine from college onwards, Christopher Moore, has been responsible for the redecoration of the interiors. Christopher is somebody you should get to talk here, by the way. He's an amazing character with the best taste in Ireland. This is all Dunnerail Court. This is Newbridge. Yeah, Fingal County Council has been very good. Fingal County Council is really the leader of the pack in this regard. It is responsible for Newbridge, for Ardgillan Castle and for Malahide Castle, and it does a terrific job at looking after those three historic properties, having them open to the public, having lots of activities and so forth. A really worthwhile enterprise. Belvedere in County Westmeath that the County Council bought when it was up for sale more than 20 years ago, which is open to the public. Could do a bit more there, I think, but anyway, but good for them. Moore Hall was bought a few years ago. Moore Hall, the family home of George Moore, wonderful writer. If you've never read A Drama in Muslin, I can't recommend it highly enough. Was burnt in 1923 because Senator Maurice Moore was obviously in the Senate, and therefore, as part of the anti-treaty campaign, it was burnt. The County Council, Mayor County Council, have bought it a few years ago, and they're carrying out works on it. Now, in October 2020, The Economist magazine carried an interesting article on the extraordinary number of new country houses being built in England. This is a quote: "The paucity of ancient piles on the market and the hefty heating bills and musty smells they come with make building from scratch a good option." And among the examples, the economist gave was Steve Gibson, a welder's son who'd made money in logistics and now owns Middlesbrough Football Club, and his new home in North Yorkshire will be the county's largest country house built there for 200 years. I do not expect something similar to happen here in Ireland. In fact, there are only 2 examples of new country houses. One is Martinstown, built by J.P. McManus in County Limerick, that some of you may know, and this is the other one. This is Kilboy, built by Shane Ryan, Tony Ryan's son, here in County Tipperary. Now, we could speculate forever why there are so few, but actually there are people taking on historic houses. This is one of them. This is Killua Castle, the other Chapman house. In fact, not D.H. Lawrence, just stick with Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence knew of this house because his father was supposed to inherit Killua. It was abandoned, it was left a shell. This is what it looked like 20 years ago, trees growing up in it. This is what it looks like today. A very nice, bizarrely Mexican couple have bought it and restored it impeccably. It's wonderful to see today. This is another house, Dromdea, in County Cork. Again, a shell. When I first went to explore it, a couple have taken it on and are gradually restoring. I think this is one of the most marvelous, beautiful entrances to any house. It's like a piece of, if you know Schinkel, the great Berlin architect of the early 19th century, it's like a piece by Schinkel. It's exquisite. This is the house as it was in the process of being restored. Oh, this is wonderful. This is Castle Freak, and a terrific man, Stephen Evans Freak, is restoring this. Again, I was there staying with him a few weeks ago. The whole house is being rebuilt. Again, it was a shell, trees growing up inside it. So there are lots of people undertaking these private initiatives. This is one of the interiors, actually, of Castle Freak now. It's a work in progress. This is all new, this plasterwork. Everything is new. He has full-time plaster workers on site, creating these extraordinary ceilings, and some of them are really quite remarkable. This is a house in County Laois, the name of which, of course, I now forget rather maddeningly. But again, it's being restored. That's all that really matters. Oh, Bellamont Forest, a very nice but slightly mad American man called John Morehart. If he hears me, I don't mean it really. This is a really Bellamont Forest in County Cavan, one of the most beautiful houses, dating from the 1720s, designed by Edward Lovett Pearce. It's being restored by John at the moment and his team. Here they are working on the ceiling, on the upstairs bedroom floor, on the drum there. This is Gloucester. I'm always raving about Gloucester. Gloucester, again, an Edward Lovett Pearce house in County Offaly. Ravishing. A very nice couple, Tom and Mary Alexander, who are complete heroes of mine. And this is it restored by them. They've done an incredible job. If you ever get a chance to go to Gloucester and County Offaly, run. It's absolutely fantastic house. Abbey Leaks, of course, was restored by David Davis and recently bought by John Collison, one of the founders of Stripe. So luckily he has a very deep pocket. Ballyfin, the aforementioned, very nice, wonderful Fred Craybill, who sadly died last year, a terrifically kind man from Chicago, who was the driving force behind that Chicago exhibition on Irish decorative arts. So Fred bought this. I remember when I first went to see the house, it was still owned by the Patrician brothers. There was water running down in the drawing room and plaster literally dripping off the ceiling onto the floor, and Fred carried out this impeccable restoration of it. Oh, this is Capard as well, this very nice American couple, the Piscerns, who've restored this. It's a great house too, great party house. This is, now just very quickly to talk about the long-standing families. Burr, of course, the Rosses have done an incredible job over the last 40 years, since Brendan and Alison Ross came back to take over from his father, after his father died. And they've really done something to turn the whole place around. The Bank of Ireland was about to close on them when they came back 40 years ago. You'll know Burr, I'm sure you've been around it, you'll be familiar with it. They really give a good example of what you can do if you work very hard. I'm conscious of time, don't worry, Julia. This, of course, is Kilruddery, the RDs, the current generation, Anthony and Fionnuala, incredibly hardworking, having all sorts of activities constantly going on here. And that's really what I want to talk about. The whole variety of things that people do. Huntingdon Castle, some of you may know it, in County Carlow, the Durden Robinsons. Again, Alex and Claire working incredibly hard, finding up all sorts of new ways. What you discover is all these houses now, this is close to me, God, I think I knew it, because they're my neighbours, the Nugents. And of course, I now forget the name of the house, Ballinlock Castle. There's a music festival there every year, as there is at Curramore altogether now, was just announced for next year's lineup and so forth, the electric picnic at Stradbally Park. People are coming up with all sorts of ways of finding means to generate income, to sustain the house, to make it pay for itself, to make it, as we say, wash its face. Here is Burris in County Carlow. If you haven't gone to the literary festival they have every year, I urge you to go. It's one of the most extraordinary, fascinating events you could imagine. It's really incredibly well run. And the rest of the time then in the ballroom wing, they have weddings and so forth, the Kavanaghs. Burtown in County Kildare, some of you may know Burtown, James and Joe Fennell who run it. She helped set up this. It's called the Green Barn. It's a hugely popular restaurant and shop now, and again it generates income to sustain their house, their family home, which has always been in James's family since it was first built in the middle of the 18th century. Slane, Alex and Karina here have turned this into a whiskey distillery, as have a number of other places. You may know, for example, Justin Green at Ballyvillan, delicious Bertha's Revenge gin. If you haven't tried it, I urge you to do so. What have we got here now? The Maddens at Hilton Park in County Monaghan. They do B&B. It's very, I always think it's kind of hilarious that Fred Madden now, whose ancestors would have been sitting up in the dining room while people brought the food up to them. Now Fred is in the kitchen because he's a trained cook, producing dinner for people sitting in his dining room upstairs. But that's how they keep themselves going, and good for them. You know, Glyn, of course, lovely, lovely Glyn, where Catherine Fitzgerald and her husband, who some of you may know, Dominic West, they're letting the house on a regular basis, as does Lismore Castle, and so on and so forth. So in other words, a whole variety of people are finding fresh, imaginative initiatives to sustain themselves, to keep the house going, and to ensure that we still have, as we go through the 21st century, country houses belonging to families, both new and old, but we have that part of our heritage preserved. So on that note, we will end, I think. Yes, we will end. This is a wonderful house called Ardbrackan, owned by a very rich American, and rather spoilingly, I live in one of the wings. So I'm very happy to say this country house is in very good nick. Thank you very much indeed for your attention. I'm sorry I had to go such a rush.